Record button. So I'd just like to welcome everybody and thank you for being here. I'm co-hosting this. My name is Judith Somm and I'm co-hosting this with my friend Rebecca Kauser. We're asking everybody to stay muted throughout this meeting. If you do have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat and Rebecca will monitor those, and also we can ask for people to raise their hands after the presentation and Rebecca can invite them to unmute and you can ask your question directly. So this is the second annual meeting of the New Hampshire Beecology Citizen Science Group. About a third of the people here tonight did participate last year and submitted data, and together we submitted about 300 bee and plant IDs, which is pretty good. And of course, we're pleased to have Dr. Robert Jagir with us here tonight, who created this project. He's going to be talking to us about how to use the beecology data, as well as some of his own research in our pollinator and biodiversity projects. Before I introduce him, I would like to acknowledge and thank Vicki Brown, who is here with us tonight. Vicki is the founder of New Hampshire Pollinator Pathways, and she was the one that told me about beecology, and that's how I got involved. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Jagir. Rob is an assistant professor and researcher of biology at the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to describe all of his vast research topics and conservation awards, but if people are interested, you can Google Jagir Lab. And actually, I'd encourage you to go and visit that because it's pretty interesting. In fact, I think we'll just send a link out to everybody after this meeting. That would be a good idea. Rob, we are so grateful to have you here. Thank you for doing this. So let's go ahead and find out what you have for us.
Okay, thank you very much. So one update, I'm now associate professor. I just got tenure.
Oh, okay.
So I'm very happy with that, about that. Not a big deal, just but I'd like to start by thanking everyone for your contributions to the Beecology Project over the past couple of years. I really appreciate it. It's been a tremendous help in terms of my research and moving conservation efforts forward. And so the plan for today is to start. So my talk has three parts. I start by giving you some background. There's a lot of talk about pollinators. A lot of people use the term pollinator, and most of the time the term is used incorrectly, which is actually having negative effects on conservation efforts. And so I'm going to start by talking about what a pollinator is and what a pollinator is not, and then roll into the Beecology Project and why I started it, and the data that you're collecting, how is it being used. And then I'm going to finish by talking about how I'm using the data around Massachusetts, and efforts are moving into New Hampshire with your help as well. And finish with some success stories that, having a data-driven conservation approach like the one that I have really makes a difference. And so with that, we start. Let me just hide my bar here. My floating controls. Okay, there we go. So many animals visit flowers to feed on the nectar and pollen. You can think of nectar as their source of fuel. So a bumblebee can live no more than or just over 24 hours without a source of nectar. So what gives it flight and keeps it moving around. And pollen is a major source of protein. In the case of bees, you can think of pollen as the way that they make new bees. So bumblebees, for example, can live long periods of time if I just give them sugar water, but they can't reproduce. They need pollen and high quality pollen in order to reproduce. Globally, there are about 200,000 species of flower visiting animal. Of the 200,000, about 1,000 are vertebrates, like the hummingbird shown here. And so the vast majority of what we see on flowers are insects. In North America, there are about 4,000 bee species, and there are about 50 bumblebee species. In the background, you can see the typical foraging environment encountered by these animals. So there are a lot of different types of flowers in bloom, and there are also a lot of animals that are looking for this resource. So there's strong competition for them to find high quality nectar and pollen sources. And so what they'll do individually is they'll go through the environment, they'll sample different flowers and select the one that gives them the highest rate of energetic return. And the one thing I want to point out with this is that it's a limited resource, right? So there's only plants replenish their nectar overnight. They'll put out new flowers with pollen. Once the pollen's gone, it's gone. Once the nectar's gone, so the animals will come out. There'll be a lot of activity early in the morning. They drain their resources and the resources change. And then things replenish through the day. And then you'll see another uptick in activity later in the afternoon. So if and only if these animals, while they're visiting flowers, transfer pollen in a way that results in fertilization and the production of seed, then and only then can we change their name from a flower visitor to a pollinator. So the term pollinator is 100% plant perspective and 0% animal perspective, right? Because you can think of many plants are pollinated by wind and pollinated by water. So they're transferring the pollen through water, so upstream to downstream, for example, or through the wind. So those vehicles are technically pollinators as well. So it's the transfer of pollen leading to the fertilization and production of seed. Now I ask, and when I give workshops, I ask, what's the definition of a pollinator? And people, I've yet to get a correct answer to this, correct definition. I often get an animal that transfers pollen. Well, that's partially true, but that's not the definition. And why that's important, so if we look at this lobelia plant, animals often transfer pollen, and it does not result in the fertilization and production of seeds and fruit. So there are many plants that are what's called self-incompatible, which means that if they receive their own pollen, it doesn't result in fertilization. So we could have a bee or a butterfly moving up this inflorescence, transferring pollen, it doesn't result in any reproduction. Similarly, if I had an animal that would take pollen from my lobelia and transfer it over here to meadowsweet, there's pollen transfer, but there's no fertilization because we're moving pollen from one species to another. And so what that means then is if pollen gets transferred between species, that there's a reproductive cost from the donor plant side because they're wasting their pollen on another plant species. In addition to that, when our meadowsweet receives the lobelia pollen, it blocks the surface of the stigma, right? So the pollen's transferred to the surface of the stigma, the pollen tube grows down, we get fertilization taking place. So the foreign pollen blocks the surface and prevents it from receiving meadowsweet pollen. So there's a major cost to plants both from the female and male side of reproduction. And so there's been strong selection for plants to get their pollen transferred to an unrelated individual of the same species, because that's going to give us increase our genetic diversity if it's unrelated, and genetic diversity is a good thing because it helps us to deal with environmental change. So there's strong selection for plants to get their pollen moving or being outcrossed, the plants to be outcrossed. So obviously wind and water, if the plant I want to mate with is upwind, I'm out of luck, right? Because the pollen's going the other direction. And so most plants are animal pollinated because animals can fly directly to this plant. And plants have a variety of tricks that they use to get animals to do this. And the reason that we see so many different flower colors, shapes, and sizes is because that's the plant's way of manipulating those animals to do this outcrossing and minimize this interspecific pollen transfer. So if we look at this this idea of a flower visitor versus pollinator with an example, just to hammer this point home. Here we have obedient plant. We have two bumblebees. So we've got Bombus fervidus up here. We've got Bombus affinis down here. So our Bombus fervidus is going into the flower. The nectar is located at the base of the tube. It's crawling into the tube and getting the nectar at the base of the flower. And in doing so, making contact with male and female reproductive organs. And so our Bombus fervidus is a pollinator, right? Assuming it's resulting in fertilization and production of seed and fruit. Our Bombus affinis, instead of going into the tube, is biting a hole at the base of the tube and stealing the nectar. So Bombus affinis is a nectar-robbing species. Bombus terricola, which you'll find in your area, give or take a few miles, is a sister species to Bombus affinis. So it's also a hole biter. They're the only two species in the East that do that. So our Bombus affinis is not a pollinator, it's a flower visitor. And in fact, we can consider it to be a parasite, right? It is benefiting at a cost to the plant. The plant's not being reproduced. Not only is the plant not reproducing, but when the Bombus affinis takes the nectar, our Bombus fervidus comes in, there's no nectar, our Bombus fervidus is going to leave and go to another plant species, and so it's lost its pollinator altogether. So I could have hundreds and hundreds of Bombus affinis on obedient plant and not have any pollination. And we're going to see why this matters, right? Here we're feeding bees, but pollination means that the plant's reproducing in addition to the animal getting food. And that's really at the core of the term pollinator and pollinator decline, and why it's so important. It has to do with pollination, and that's pollination of native plants. That's the key here. And what happens is that people see animals visiting flowers and say, oh, this is a great pollinator plant. Well, no, it's not. If I had thousands of Bombus affinis, and by the way, Bombus affinis is the first bumblebee on the endangered species list. It's locally extinct. Clearly, it's important in terms of conservation, but it's not a pollinator of this plant. And I can't call my Bombus affinis a pollinator until I introduce the plant that it actually pollinates. I can't hope that this bee is going to pollinate. I need to know that the plant's there, that it's pollinating, that it pollinates. Similarly, if I could invent a feeder to save all the bees in the globe and just feed them and keep them going, I'm not helping pollinators at all. Because again, my Bombus fervidus, it's not about the bee, it's about its functional role as a pollinator of native plants. It's important. So I can sustain both of these bees with feeders, but I'm still not helping pollinators, because that's a plant-based term and I need to consider plant reproduction. And this is a very important point that everybody misses for whatever reason, that it is about the relationship between the animal and the plant, and specifically animal foraging and plant reproduction. And those two have co-evolved together. Plants are looking for animals and have co-evolved with animals to pollinate them, and these animals have evolved different traits like tongue length, different behaviors to be able to exploit certain types of flowers. So to look at this again, and again, I hear the term, this is a great pollinator plant. This is a pollinator-friendly garden. These terms are absolutely meaningless, right? What you're doing is it's a great place for flowers, or any plant, flowering plant that has nectar and pollen is going to feed something. That doesn't mean it's a pollinator. So let's take this example. Consider this example, pineland golden trumpet, right? Here are all of the things. There are 12 different species that are observed on our pineland golden trumpet, right? Only 3 of them, of the 12, are actually pollinators. So if I didn't have these 3 species, I would have 9 species, lots of activity on my pineland golden trumpet. People say, oh, this is a pollinator magnet, right? Not a single one of those animals is pollinating. It is not a pollinator. And we can't hope that those animals are going to go pollinate something else. They very well might pollinate something else, but we need that something else to call them a pollinator, right? Similarly, I could get rid of the 12 or the 9 and just have the 3, and I would have the 3 pollinators. So even though I wouldn't have the diversity, I would have that connection. I would have the pollinators, and I would have that important process of pollination that I need to help biodiversity. And we're going to see how those two are linked together. So the plant and all of its pollinators are called a pollination system. And as I mentioned before, the plants have evolved different mechanisms in terms of their floral traits, their nectar and pollen characteristics that attract certain types of animals, and those animals fit with the flower. So some plants are looking for small bees, some plants are looking for large-bodied bees as their pollinators, some are looking for birds. And you'll notice here we've got a bumblebee that's visiting Prunella vulgaris, self-heal. And you'll notice that there's a lot of pollen on the thorax of the bee. Why? Because it's very difficult for the bee to groom the pollen off of the thorax. Bees are trying to collect pollen, which is plant gametes, male gametes. The plants need it for reproduction. They give up some to the bees because some will get transferred, but they've evolved different mechanisms to deposit in places on the bee where it's very hard for the bee to groom it off. So there's a higher likelihood that it'll get transferred. Our hummingbird pollinated flower, right? Nectar is located down here. A bee could easily get this nectar, and they do, but they bypass the male and female reproductive organs, right? So the plant tries to deter them. How does it deter it? Well, the qualities of the nectar, the orientation of the flower, the color of the flower, all deter bees from visiting. And hummingbirds, it fits with hummingbirds. So the pollen's deposited on the forehead of the hummingbird. Why? Because if it deposited pollen on the wings of the hummingbird, it wouldn't be a very efficient pollen transfer mechanism. Some of these systems are generalized, which means they have multiple animals that will act as pollinators. Some are highly specialized. So here we've got a plant and a fly pollinator. If we lose the plant, the fly goes extinct. If we lose the fly, the plant goes extinct. So it's a one-to-one relationship. And here we have butterflies. All the specks you can see are pollen. So we have butterfly pollinated plants. We have bee pollinated plants. And so it's not all about the bees. There are many plants that aren't looking for bees. They're looking for birds. They're looking for moths. They're looking for butterflies. And collectively, all these different connections between the plant and the pollinator. So I call them pollination systems because that makes, instead of, I move away from using the term pollinator because it's so abused and misused and misunderstood. I use pollination system because it forces you to think of the process. It forces you to think of the plant and animal as one. And we have all these plant-animal connections, and the diversity of those connections play an important role in ecosystems. Now, how do they do that? Well, you can imagine that we've got different types of seeds and fruit, different qualities being produced by all these different pollination systems. And these seeds and fruit and plant material are providing food, nester and nests, sites and shelter for the next trophic level, right? So small mammals are eating the seeds, using the plant material to nest. And those animals are prey for our predatory birds, predatory species. And so we can think of these pollination systems as a foundation, and the diversity of systems is giving us diversity of food, which is supporting diversity at other trophic levels. So we think of these pollination systems as biodiversity building blocks, and they're a key to a healthy ecosystem. And why are these healthy ecosystems important? Well, they're important because they play an important role in maintaining human health and well-being through ecosystem services. So these are things we get from nature for free. So, recreation, tourism, water purification, it's all healthy and diverse ecosystems that give us these things. And as we start to erode, right, as we start to erode this level and we start to lose connections either from the plant side or the animal side, eventually we're going to see experience what's called ecosystem collapse. We're going to get a massive reduction in biodiversity very rapidly because we don't have our foundation, right? And we're going to lose all these services. And if we can, invent alternatives, if it's even possible, it's going to cost a lot of money. So if we look at the other, so you'll notice here that pollination is one of the ecosystem services. Yes, but that pollination, this is ecological pollination from an ecological perspective. But when you hear the term pollinator, most often we're thinking about agricultural pollination, right? And this is a whole different world. Here we've got a bunch of non-native species, or a handful actually, honeybee being the main one, but we also have a handful of native species that do the pollinating. one bumblebee species basically out of the 50. So we've got 4,000 bee species. We only have 5, 6, 7, let's say, that are used for agricultural pollination. We need to pollinate one thing and lots of it. So we've got acres and acres of one thing. That's why honeybees are so good, is because you've got in this box, you've got 50,000 individuals. Bumblebee colonies get to about, the largest that I've heard about is 2,000 individuals. These are not native plants. They may have come from native ancestors, but we've selectively bred them to, to do things that would benefit us. And we're producing food for just one species, where you could throw in domesticated animals as you want. So it's a very reduced and linear system and very artificial, right? We've created these systems to help us. But in this system, only about 5% of the native bee species actually visit crop plants, right? So when we start to think, when pollinator decline started to become important to people, it was all about honeybees and colony collapse disorder. And 1 out of every 3 bites of food we take comes from a pollinator. I still hear that. And yes, that's important, but it's in the process, people are trying to, let's save the honeybee. Well, honeybees are non-native. And when you put honeybees into this context, they're competitors and they're actually detrimental because, as I said, there are limited resources, limited nectar and pollen. You've got 50,000 individuals in one hive alone competing against species that just, it's a numbers game. They're getting washed out. It's a problem, right? So what we do here is very different than what we do here. And we have to think about it in completely different ways. The two can coexist, but when people want to save the bees, they're saving bees for crop pollination. It's only 5%. What happens to the other 95%? Well, they just go extinct because who cares? Well, you should care because of the ecosystem services. So as I mentioned, these systems, as we know, the systems are being degraded, right? So here's some data that I have for bumblebees. This is museum specimens, museum data from 2000, pre-2000, the blue bars, and 2015 to 19, the yellow bars. And you can see that, the yellow bars are below the blue bars in many cases. Bombus affinis, there are no yellow bars because it's locally extinct. I'm hopeful that there's still some in Western Mass, but I've yet to find one. The same's for butterflies, right? So all of the species here in red are declining, and it's the same for our native plants. And not surprisingly, our native plants in decline, like Penstemon hircitus, is pollinated by our bees in decline, like Bombus viridis. But what I want to point out here is that not everything is in decline. Some species are doing better than they've done historically. So while some are headed in the direction of extinction, others are doing quite well. What this means is we cannot use a one-size-fits-all approach. Again, just because I see a bunch of bees on a plant does not mean that we have a healthy system, because more often than not, those are all the common species like Bombus impatiens, where in August you'll have thousands of them where of a single species where you should have 5 or 6 other species there that are no longer present. So it's about diversity and not abundance. In agriculture, it's all about abundance. We need to get that one thing pollinated and we'll swamp the system with individuals. Ecologically, what we want is diversity. The diversity of native plants and the animals that pollinate them is giving us diversity at other trophic levels. So that's the two sides of this pollinator issue that nobody seems to talk about, but is extremely important. So my research is focusing on the ecological side of things, right? So figuring out why these individuals, why are some species in the same habitat, right? They have very similar, habits, right? Foraging habits and nesting habits, what we know about it, but yet some are in big trouble and others aren't. So why do we see these differential declines? And there are a number of reasons that have been proposed. And so my lab's working on all of these things, and I could give you a talk on each one of these topics, and we obviously don't have time. So I'm focusing here on habitat change, particularly how are non-native plants and how is habitat loss, habitat change affecting foraging habitat. I'll talk a bit about nest sites and overwintering sites. We know less about those, but the main focus for today is going to be on these floral resources. We know that neonicotinoid pesticides are bad. I've published a lot of work on effects on learning and memory. So they have these sublethal effects. They change behavior in a way that negatively affects survival and reproduction. Climate change puts things out of sync. So some plants are developed based on temperature, some develop based on day length. The bees, it's a temperature thing. So if we get a bee coming out before the flower blooms, the bee doesn't have food. And if we have the flower come out before the bee, we don't have a pollinator. And so this mismatch can drive decline. Disease, we know that there are a lot of diseases moving from honeybees to bumblebees. And so this is a major problem. But anyway, so I'm going to focus on this one down here. So my solution, looking at the way that the pollinator conservation and conserving pollination has been going, I realize that we have a lack of information on individual species. We know that certain species are declining, but we don't know enough about their life history to say, yeah, this is why the species is declining. And there isn't a lot of work in this area. In terms of bees, there's a lot of taxonomy, right? People want to know where things are and what they are. But when they're doing these collections, they're putting out bowls and they're killing and pinning and seeing what's there. They're not recording what those bees are actually doing. Are they visiting a flower? Are they visiting for nectar or pollen? And this information is extremely important. We want to understand how we're disrupting things in a way that's leading to species decline. So in bees, we need to look at their life cycle, right? So they're coming out of hibernation now. They need a place to overwinter. They come out, they need to find a good nest site. Once they find a nest site, they need to find good sources of pollen and nectar. And then they need enough individuals so that the males can find the females to complete the cycle. In butterflies, obviously, we need host plants, but as adults, they need nectar plants, and they also need overwintering sites. And so people have a lot of, there's a lot of attention. We know a lot about host plants, but we know very little about nectar plant usage at the species level. Same with the bees. And I'd like to point out that in the case of the bees, there's a lot of talk about specialists and how we have to focus on specialists. Well, not necessarily, right? Something that's rare, species can be rare and still be stable. If you're rare, but you used to be abundant, that's a red flag, and that's something we need to look at. But specialists, there are varying degrees of specializations. If you're a specialist on goldenrod, you're not in trouble, right? If you're a specialist on a plant species that's rapidly declining, then yes, then you're going to be in trouble. And so the idea that specialist means we should focus conservation efforts on it is untrue. And unfortunately, that's getting a lot of attention in the case of the bees. Also the plants, it's shocking to me how little we know about plant reproduction and who are the pollinators of these plant species in decline. They certainly don't report on any government site, that there just isn't any research on who is pollinating. And so what I'm going to do now is talk about how we are figuring these things out with your help, and also things I'm doing on the side in the lab. So obviously, if you're trying to figure out what a species likes to eat, you just ask it, right? How do you ask it? Well, you go out and survey it in different locations, and you see if any patterns emerge in what it's using for as a source of nectar and pollen. So this is just showing you, and everybody or most people here are familiar with the bees, the species, the target species are in red. And so originally I had these study sites. So this is Western Mass, this is above 1,000 feet over here. Then we get to below 1,000 feet down here through the Cape. So these are the orange are my high elevation sites and the blue are my low elevation sites. So these sites vary in size. This is Breakneck Hill, which is my main research site in Massachusetts. It's about 40 acres. And I just walked up and down from May. So these lines are transects. So I did surveys on these lands every week from April, May through October. And I had some help from grad students as well. And, doing that, I very quickly found some very interesting patterns, and I needed to expand the number of sites and get more data. And I had a small research lab, and I thought, well, there are a lot of people interested in bees and pollinators and pollination, so maybe I can get some of them to help. And so I created the Citizen Science Project around 2015, 16. And the goal here was to collect the ecological data. So, of course, I'm interested in where bees are, as everybody else is that's in the pollinator conservation game. But why the Beecology project is different than anything else is the ecology part. I am interested in what they are interacting with and how they are interacting with it. What are they visiting? Is it a male worker or queen that's doing it? Are they collecting nectar or pollen? Right. And then I can compile those data from across different locations, across different timeframes to come up with a preferred plant list. And so I started asking people to send me videos, and that became overwhelming. And so I collaborated with some faculty at Worcester Polytechnic Institute to develop a web app to help to get data into a database that I could then look at, and it would sort it for me, and it would be easier for me to manage. And so that's where we are today with the web app. So what's interesting is that what I'm finding with the Beecology data that you've collected and others is absolutely consistent with what I found with more rigorous scientific research, right? Those surveys that, following different protocols. So here we have results for July. And so all these bees are at the same location, the same time. And I observed bees on a bee on 25 different plant species. But here we can see the proportion of visits to different plant species, and all of the species, the vast majority of the species, maybe impatiens is an exception. Over 50% of their visits were to one or two plant species for nectar, right? So this is showing a high degree of preference. And again, all of the plant species are equally available to all these bees, but you notice that they're doing different things. And a lot of this can be explained based on tongue length. Not surprisingly, short-tongued bees are on milkweed and are on goldenrod. And the long-tongued bees are on long tubular flowers like vetch and goldenrod. But what you'll notice here is, so the ones in red are the species, target species. The species are showing preferences for different plants. Even though they have the same tongue length, same size, they can access the resource, they're doing different things. So Bombus vagans loves bush honeysuckle. So does Bombus perplexus, which is a medium-tongued bee. So both of these bees are on that plant. The other ones aren't, for whatever reason. And I'm doing subsequent research and collaborating with a group from Cornell University, and it turns out that it's likely what's in the nectar in terms of these volatile organic compounds in the nectar. So they like the taste. But anyway, Bombus borealis has a long tongue. It loves milkweed, which is odd because milkweed isn't a long tubular flower. The others are on vetch. Bombus impatiens is doing something completely different, right? It's a super generalist. So we see these differences for nectar. When we look at, so if we look at, and you'll notice that these are non-native. So if we look at across sites, what are the native plant connectors, right? So we're trying to reconnect the animals and the native plants to restore these pollination systems. Here's the list of partners for nectar, right? Right now, wood betony is just blooming. It is so highly preferred. So I have some in my yard, a small patch. I saw 2 queens on it on a small patch at the same time. And I'm getting reports from all of the sites that have this wood betony right now that the queens are all over it. And I'll talk about why in a second. Lupin's the next one to come into bloom. It's important. The penstemons into Monarda are extremely important. Prunella, giant hyssop, and jewelweed and showy goldenrod into the fall. So this will give you nectar for these bees of conservation concern. This is what they told me they prefer. We put it in, we'll see in a bit, not to spoil the ending, but you put these plants in, and the first bees on site are the bees that we're trying to help, which is great, but hold that thought. So for pollen, and this was a shock to me, is that, again, we've got 25 plant species, all these bees, they were only visiting 2 plants on site for pollen, showing pollen collecting behavior to any significant degree, and that's meadowsweet and St. John's wort. What was interesting here is that Bombus fervidus, I didn't see any bees collecting pollen, actively collecting pollen. And so when we look at, and some other ones, purple flowering raspberry is another good one. The native roses were good at different sites. So this is just from one site. But when we look at the proportion of bees actively collecting pollen, so this is some of the work from my graduate student. So bees that were just collecting nectar are the black bars. Those that were collecting pollen are the open bars. And you'll see that Bombus fervidus and Bombus vagans don't do very much active pollen collection. These are the two target bee species. So what this means is that these bees are getting most of their pollen from the plants where they're collecting nectar passively. So other species do a lot of active pollen collection, like Perplexus and Impatiens, but these bees seem to be getting their pollen passively. That means that wherever they're going for nectar, they have to accept the quality of pollen that they receive. And so if they're visiting red clover, they're going to get red clover pollen whether they like it or not, because that's the source of nectar that they have, and they're out competing other species because of their long tongue. When we look at pollen quality, however, we see that the clovers, right? So here's white clover, here's a clover, red clover is probably in here somewhere. Here's dandelion, by the way. Everybody's like, oh, we got no mow May. We've got to keep that dandelion. Dandelion has crappy nectar and crappy pollen. If you see bees on dandelion, it's because they're starved. You could think of it like fast food, right? We'll eat fast food rather than starve, but eating too much fast food isn't good for you. And if you have fine dining option available, you're going to take it. And fine dining is penstemon. Fine dining is pedicularis, and fine dining is St. John's wort for pollen. And so what is happening, you think, is that Bombus fervidus is getting a lot of crappy pollen, enough to keep the population going at low numbers, and certainly enough nectar to fuel it. But when we start putting in the penstemons, higher quality pollen for this bee, we start to see numbers go up. And we'll see that in a second as well. So the pollen that we have even in the nectar plants is extremely important, and they vary in their pollen quality. So that pedicularis that I talked about is a super high quality pollen, great source of nectar, and is a key spring plant for bees in general. So from bees, last year we introduced, or 2 years ago, we introduced butterflies in the app. So we're trying to collect data on butterflies. I had a grad student go out and collect data on butterflies. It seems that, oh, I skipped over. So not surprisingly, the butterflies are showing the same patterns as the bees. So going out, surveying butterfly plant interactions, looking for patterns, and we see very clear patterns. Butterflies like the common ringlet, only 9% of the flowers that they visited had a long tube, so they tended to prefer flowers without a tube or a short tube. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the northern broken dash. Most of what it was visiting was long tube, and we're seeing preferences for native plants as well. Tiger swallowtail is another one that likes long tube natives. And so, we hope to get more data through Beecology for the butterflies so that we can develop a really solid list for them as well. All right. So just very quickly, this is new to the talks that I give, but I think it's equally important, and that's looking at native plant decline and how is it that we know. So we know what the bees are preferring. The question is, are they pollinating what they're visiting, right? As I mentioned, there's a difference between a flower visitor and a pollinator. So we want to understand how important is animal pollination to the plant, first of all, just having something pollinated. And then secondly, who are the main pollinators of this particular plant species? So I have another grad student working on this. And we were looking at this in penstemon. And what's interesting is Bob Vila, everybody loves Bob Vila and trusts what he says, I'm sure. And making a comment about things backyard birds love penstemon because it's a prolific seed producer, right? Okay, so let's plant some penstemon in our backyards, lots of it, and let's spray it with pesticides and see if we have a bunch of birds coming and we have a lot of seeds for the birds to eat, right? That's the question. And so what we did was we looked at so here are the 3 penstemon species in the area, and this is their status. So Penstemon hirsutus is in trouble in Massachusetts. Penstemon digitalis isn't. So we looked at these 2 species, and what we did was we did what's called pollination or bagging experiments. So we bagged the flowers before they bloom, flowers bloom, and then we take the bags off and let things visit, and then we rebag it, or we take the bag off and put it back on without anything visiting. So you can see that we can look at how much the plant can reproduce by itself with no help, and how much it produces when it gets help. And then when we record the individuals visiting the flowers, we can see, if a bumblebee visits, we can see how good it is as a pollinator. So at the end of the season, we collect the seeds and count them up, measure the fruit weight and the seed number to figure these things out. And interestingly, so here on the X here, we're looking at self, right? So how much can they use their own pollen? The sham is just, if we take the bag off and put it back on, it's going to shake the flower. How much pollination results from that? The bag sham as well. It's just a variant of that. We can see that in both cases, so this is digitalis, this is hirsutus, that without something visiting it, it can't produce much seed at all, right? Open pollination, this is we take the bag off and let everything visit till the flower falls off, and then we just bag what's left and count the seeds. We can see that clearly animal pollination is critical for seed production in both of these penstemons. So they're not prolific seed producers unless they have something to pollinate it, right? So the self and the outcross is us taking paintbrushes and simulating transfer or pollen transfer to different plants. But what was interesting here is when we look at who was visiting, so here we've got small bees visiting, and here we have larger bees, bumblebees visiting, and this is the percent that actually function as a pollinator. We can see that very few of the small bees actually function as pollinators. There are a lot of small bees visiting, very few are pollinating. The bumblebees, most of them are pollinating, and we break down the bumblebees, we see the long-tongued bees like vagans and bimaculatus are doing most of the pollination compared to impatiens that doesn't do as much pollinator. So not only are bumblebees the important pollinators of Penstemon hirsutus, a species in decline, but the long-tongued bees are the ones that are the main pollinators. Those are the ones we need to keep around. Guess what? Vagans is declining. Bimaculatus is more or less stable, but if we're in an area where it was vagans dependent, then this species is not going to be able to produce many seeds, and therefore it's limiting food for the next trophic level. All right, so when we look at, think back to Bob Vila's statement, that's true, but you need the pollinators to do it. And again, thinking about the plant pollinator system and the connection to the next trophic level and why pollination is important. Pollination is important because it's producing seeds that other things are going to eat to keep them living. It's a connection, right? It's a network that we're trying to preserve. All right, so that's how we collect the data. And the next part of this is how is it that we use the data to restore, and what success are we having with this? We've been, since COVID, we've been putting these conservation habitats in and looking to see what effect they have. But before I get there, I want to just call back to that we're restoring pollination networks and not feeding flower visitors, right? Why that's important. I'm giving you another example because I've seen a lot of news about hummingbirds coming in, and let's get our feeders out. Now let's look at why that's not a great idea. All right, so here we've got our hummingbird feeder. We put it out, sugar water. We've got tons of hummingbirds, hundreds of hummingbirds. They can reproduce. They're extremely happy, right? So we are helping our hummingbirds, which is great, right? That's one species. If we were to put in Monarda or something that is pollinated by hummingbirds, we're not only feeding the hummingbirds, but hummingbirds are pollinating the plant and producing seeds that are being eaten by purple finch. The plant material is, so Monarda is a host plant for the orange mint moth. The larvae are also eaten by birds. I don't know if any of you have seen Doug Talmy, but that's his angle on all of this, is that we need the host plants because the larvae, the caterpillars, are food for birds. But also the adults are food for something like the eastern whippoorwill, which is a bird species that decline. So here we are saving one thing. Here we are saving pollination, and we're saving 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different things, right? It's likely more than that, but this is just one example. And so we lose that, all of that, because the hummingbirds, even if they had these plants available, are going to go to the feeder. They're not stupid. It's one-stop shopping, unlimited food. Of course they're going to do this. Now, if we put in a non-native plant, we are doing the same thing as putting a feeder in. Often, the animals don't like the nectar and pollen. If they do, and they may even pollinate, the birds don't want to eat the seeds, right? So here we're feeding and making this one species happy, but we're also losing all of this biodiversity, native biodiversity. And so this is what we need to do, and this is why we need to do it. This is why we're saving the pollinators. It's putting plants in and plant diversity with pollen, with the animal diversity that's giving us the diversity of wildlife, right? We're supporting the ecosystem. That's the goal. So all of this has ended up, so I have my plant list on my website, and that'll be given out if you don't already have it, and it constantly changes. I haven't updated it this year yet. There are just a few plants, I think, that will be modified, and I'll get some of the butterfly data in there. But clearly this is data driven. It's based on, at this point, over 20,000 observations have gone into this list. So let's compare it to other things that are out here. The traditional approach. First of all, the traditional approach is let's group everything together. So bees, there are 4,000 bee species, but this plant is good for bees. Well, let's look what's good for bees. Here we have columbine and pussy toes. So this, although some bees will visit columbine, it's nowhere near the quality of something like pedicularis in the spring, right? Also, it comes out a bit later. It's not a major source of pollen, right? So in terms of the plants that I've identified as being beneficial to Bombus affinis and species of conservation concern, we don't get those till the Monarda and the penstemons. But as we go down the list, we see a lot of goldenrod and aster, right? But the goldenrod and asters are the bees that, when they need it and what they need, it's not goldenrods and asters. And also, I listed 5 or 6 different pollen plants. They're not even on this list, right? So if we look at the kits we could select, so we want Monarda, we want these two, and this pussy toes is a really good host plant, right? So we want the pussy toes. So we want these 3 things to target species of conservation concern. So we'd have to pick kit 1. If we pick kit 2 and 3, we're not helping species that actually need it. So that's the problem. Now, so that's Native Plant Trust, but they do have, Native Plant Trust does have some good plants. Penstemon hirsutus, Lobelia syphilitica is great, Prunella. All of these are great. They're on the list, and we know that they're preferred by these species. Yet, the same list, we've got all of these cultivars. And the problem with cultivars is, and people say, well, they're nativars, they're from native plants, but we've selected them for certain traits, not traits that benefit the animals and help to solidify the connection and the seed production. It's for us. We want them to be showy. We want them to do this or look this way or do that way, do this or do that. An example, echinacea, right? So we look at echinacea. So here's echinacea. Here's the native, here are the cultivars, right? So this is Annie White's work from University of Vermont. I've seen this all the time with plants that I was told were straight species, but they're not. Here's all bees. So let's look at bumblebees. Bumblebees, here's so this is Bombus griseicollis, by the way. The echinacea isn't preferred by vagans and Fervidus. But anyway, here's the straight species. Here are the cultivars, right? So what happens when you breed for color, the plant only has so many resources to go around. You breed for size or show. It gives something, it has to give something up, and it gives up nectar production. So a lot of these plants have low nectar production. If any nectar production at all, it affects the pollen quality. It can affect its function as a host plant. And we haven't studied this, but we know that it occurs fairly frequently. And so that's why these nativars are an issue. So my main sites, Rehoboth, Southborough, and Dartmouth, just some of my main sites. This is in a library in Southborough. So they put in a bunch of my plants here. And I can say every single place that I put these plants in has been a success. In fact, it has shocked me in a positive way. Some of the first bees on site are the species of conservation concern. And to put this in perspective, at Breakneck Hill, 40 acres, some years I don't see any Bombus fervidus, yet I see multiple at the same time, the same observation period. And so these are all pictures of the target species visiting flowers in the habitats that I've created. So to put this in perspective, as I said, at Breakneck Hill, surveying every year from 2015 to 2019 before the ecology habitats went in, average 5 per year. Sometimes, and this is over 40 acres, surveying from May through October. Some years I don't see any, but that's increased over from 2021, 2022. I'm hoping it's going to increase over the next couple of years to 25 per year. So even though they were present, again, the red clover is available, the vetch, the low pollen quality, we give them penstemons and Monarda, and we start to see the numbers go up, which is very encouraging. So we planted, so here's the ecology, so here's 40 acres, here's how much we put in. It's next to nothing. So you don't need to put in a lot. You just need to put in the right thing, which people tend not to do. They're putting in black-eyed Susan, they're putting in mountain mint, which attracts a lot of one thing, but it's the common species like honeybees and bombus impatiens. These two here, we see a lot of activity, but we don't need to help them. They don't need any help. So in this wetland area, it was all purple loosestrife. It was all honeybees, thousands of honeybees and bombus impatiens, a few butterflies. What we didn't see a lot of were the two targets. So we planted here, but we also removed the purple loosestrife. When we removed the loosestrife, all of these natives came in. So loosestrife was suppressing, the non-native was suppressing native diversity. We unlocked the native diversity, got all these species, and here's a video. On the same plant, that's a Bombus vagans, that's this one. And this on the same plant, that's Bombus fervidus. So 40 acres, I don't see a single Bombus fervidus. We unlock the native diversity and the plants that they like, and all of a sudden, we see both on the same plant. Even I go a whole year without seeing two of them on site. So it was remarkable change. So you don't necessarily need to put things in. If you get rid of some of the invasives, you'll unlock the natives that would bring back and restore these pollination systems. So it's not just about the non-native plants. So I mentioned honeybees. So just to put this into perspective, so here's Monarda. Carpenter bees bite holes. So I talked about nectar robbing. So here's a carpenter bee biting a hole at the base. It's got a really short tongue. It can't get in and get the nectar legitimately like our long tongue bees. So at the last week of July, I saw Bombus fervidus, Bombus vagans visiting Monarda flowers, and there were a few carpenter bees, and I saw them biting holes. I come back the next week, all honeybees. Honeybees have a short tongue. Honeybees in the system, swamped the system, started to use the holes because they could get the nectar, and I didn't see a single fervidus or vagans. Literally, the honeybees pushed these bees off of the plant, and they went back to vetch and red clover, which they don't do as well on. So in a week, like these numbers go from, like a honeybee will go from 10 to 100, like in a day as they recruit. As I mentioned, mountain mint, just to put it in perspective, even with the common bumblebees, there were 100 honeybees to 12 common bumblebees. That's Bombus impatiens. The same with the goldenrods. It's like a 10-to-1 ratio of honeybees to native bumblebees, the common ones. There weren't any other bees, certainly no at-risk species, and no other bees there because of competition, right? They're just, you can't deal with those numbers that the honeybees produce. And so I'm going to finish with just what am I doing at home. So I have all these plant species. I have about 1/4 of an acre here in Framingham. I put in all these plant species. And, I do this on a larger scale as well. Selective mowing, right? So this is all prunella. I put seed around trees. I see it come up and I just mow around it. You'll notice that my grass looks like crap, and there's a reason for that. Ideal nesting sites. These are all ground nesting bee sites. I was out today, saw 20 or so ground nesting bees all around my property. Tons of white clover. I put in the prunella. So tons of white clover, honeybees, and common bumblebees. I put in the prunella. Here's Bombus vagans, a target that I have at my house. I live about 5 minutes or less from Garden in the Woods. Rarely see this bee. Put in the right plants. It shows up even in an urban environment. Also skippers. Skippers love Southfield. They don't like the white clover. So I'm seeing native skippers. The European skipper loves white clover, but the natives prefer the prunella. So here's some shots of some skippers visiting the prunella on my property. Lastly, as I mentioned, it's about the pollination system as connecting to native biodiversity. So this is a shot of a white-throated sparrow, which is a species of conservation concern, feeding on a shrubby St. John's wort that was pollinated by a bumblebee species of conservation concern. So this is the same plant at Breakneck Hill. Here's my Bombus vagans collecting pollen and pollinating. Here's the bird eating the seeds later in the fall. They like to nest with cover, and shrubby St. John's wort provides the seeds and the cover that it needs. And so we saw this bird. So we're starting to look at connections now later in the season. What are we actually helping in terms of wildlife? And with that, finish with, this is Breakneck Hill. You can see the 40 acres in the background. This is purple giant hyssop. All the activity you can see, these are all birds feeding on the seeds. It was just a mass of birds later in the, or in the fall, feeding on those seeds. And before I put in the purple giant hyssop, those birds were nowhere to be seen. So you can see that the benefits or the products of pollination, that's supporting bird diversity. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody here. And I'd like to thank you again. You're going to make it on this list if you're not already here. This is an older thank you slide, but I have to update it. But thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Wow, thank you for all of that, Rob. That was awesome.
Oh.
So the very first comment we had was just an appreciation for comparing how you're describing native ecosystems versus agriculture. I think a lot of times that gets lost with the Save the Bees movement, especially. So that was great. And then, if you could talk a little bit more about climate change and impacts. And I don't know what it looked like in Massachusetts this last year, but in New Hampshire, we got hit pretty hard several times with flooding. So we had extreme floods. And so we're wondering if that could be an increasing threat too, and if there's anything that restoring pollination systems can do to help support resiliency for bumblebees.
Right. So for the first part, so what we're seeing is the extremes. And I think in the spring, the biggest problem that I've seen, I mean, things long-term might be going out of sync. And there's some data from out west showing that's a problem, that things aren't getting pollinated because the flowers are coming out of bloom before the bees are emerging, just because the climate change is putting things out of sync. In this area, what I've seen is the temperature fluctuations. So a couple of years ago, we had a warm period followed by a major cold snap, and it affected plants and bees for that entire season. And I was worried that we just saw a local extinction event. Things seem to have bounced back, but I could see multiple years of that in a row being a major problem. You know, those temperature fluctuations at a global scale, it's a hard thing to scale up. But I will say that having diverse and functioning ecosystems can benefit locally. I'm not sure directly with the climate change issue, if, you know, every little bit helps. And if everybody did something, then collectively we would do something. But realistically, I'm not sure that we could right the ship just by restoring pollination systems. That would be a stretch, I think. But
I was also appreciative that you mentioned you had the quarter acre for your home, right?
yes, yeah.
Yeah, so that whenever you're talking about these larger sites, you know, it builds this big picture, but then hearing that your home has a smaller property that you're still managing in a thoughtful way makes me feel like, oh, even though I have a smaller property too, there's still things that I could be doing thoughtfully.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the point of that. And I will say that if you remember back to the slide I showed of Breakneck Hill, it's 40 acres, but what I put in was minimal. Like it was a small fraction of that land, and it's still having an impact. The other thing that we did there was the selective mowing, right? So people with an old field, they just want to go in and they're like, what's the best time to mow? And there is no good time to mow, just like there's no good time to do a spring or fall cleanup in particular, but also the spring cleanup. So what I have people doing is selective mowing. So they'll mow a third and leave a third. and we're seeing the plants that, instead of being mowed to the ground and being small, they're able to produce more of a resource. And we're mowing around plants. So I'll go out and stake out native rose and bush honeysuckle, and they'll just mow around it, and they'll keep the islands of native plants that are helping these bees. And I brought that home, and so I'll do selective mowing around the prunella. Instead of mowing everything, you just mow around the good stuff, and eventually it'll go to seed and you can mow it then. But that strategy has really worked to maintain the resource, in my area. And I would say I'm in a urban area. I have houses all around me in a small area, but I can keep things looking neat if that's a big thing to you or your neighbors, but still maintain the function, which is a big thing.
Perfect. So we're also getting a few questions about the native plants. So you did show a list of, I think it was the Native Plant Trust had the list of native plants. And
Yeah.
a lot of times we're finding things that are showing up native, or they might even say the Northeast, but these plants are not actually native to this area. So are there any concerns about using something that maybe historically is native to the Midwest, but using it here? Or, can you say anything else
Right.
about
Yes,
that?
I can. So that's a big discussion. So this ecotype, local ecotype is a big buzzword that everybody's using now. And so the concern is outbreeding depression. And if you're talking about a species of conservation concern, I think people, there's this whole move that we have to maintain our native genetic diversity. But honestly, if I gave anybody at Native Plant Trust or any of these plant groups 2 plants and said which one comes from the West and which one doesn't, they couldn't tell you. They aren't genotyping anything. So it's a lot of I'll say that the problem is if you're bringing something from an extreme, that it's just not going to do well in a habitat that differs from where you brought it from. I think that's the biggest concern. The genetics of it, if you have a species that had a lot of diversity and then we reduce it either through fragmentation, that there's a threshold, and if you go below that diversity, that it's going to rapidly go extinct, locally extinct. And so bringing in genetic information to get that diversity up is actually a good thing in many cases. And so I don't see that. I've got plants from Prairie Moon that I've put in that I'm looking to see how do they do against things that I've got locally, and I don't see any difference between the two. The bees aren't discriminating at all. And we could have a long discussion, and I've had these discussions before about, the importance of local ecotypes and plant conservation, but I danced around that, I guess, but
It was still a good answer. I know that even in my home, I was very excited about my lupins and watching bees collect and seeing the different bumblebees visit lupin, and then being told the lupin that I had's not actually native to the East Coast. It's a West Coast variety.
oh yeah. So
Yeah.
that part is, so I will say that non-natives in general, I'm not saying, and non-native, what is native, and things are changing with climate change, everything's moving north. And so I have what's in North America versus what's in Europe. But the point is that I'm not saying to go and mow down all your red clover, because these bees are
Yeah.
surviving on red clover. What I'm saying is to introduce something that was in the area historically, and then get rid of the non-native. So you sort of swap it in. That's the strategy that you use. And that's what I've been doing successfully. And you'll see that they'll move to the native from the non-native often because they like it better. It's just not available to them. But pulling things from the West that didn't occur here naturally is different than pulling something that was here, but you have an ecotype from New Hampshire versus one from Rhode Island, where it's the same species. And does that really matter? And some people make a huge deal out of it, and I really don't think it matters as much as they think it does. Bringing in a new species from somewhere else is a different thing. And I'd say that, getting the native lupin in and then sort of swapping out would be good, but not necessary. Like the lupin is a major source of pollen, and so I would keep it, but try to get the other one in, just because lupin is a plant species of conservation concern. So you'd want to try to get populations
Get
of
the
what was
regular one
here.
in.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for that. What about anise hyssop? Is it useful?
Yeah, so there's a big difference between that one and the purple giant hyssop. So you see a lot of non-natives and common bees. I haven't seen a lot of Fervidus and vagans on it. The purple, so I have both of them together, and there's a very clear difference. And what's interesting for Terricola, the narrow leaf mountain mint they love, but the other mountain mints they don't. So that's why on my list I have one mountain mint, but not the others. And when I talk about mountain mint not necessarily being beneficial, it's in the east where we're talking about Fervidus and vagans. We're not talking about Terricola. Terricola likes the narrow leaf mountain mint. But mountain mint and black-eyed Susan get a lot of attention. I don't know why, because black-eyed Susan, if you look at how much is actually visiting black-eyed Susan, it's next to nothing. But it's in everybody's list has black-eyed Susan. But anyway, sorry, I went off on a tangent there.
That's okay. Well, I'm just gonna switch
Oh,
gears.
the hyssops.
Oh.
Sorry, the hyssops. Yeah, the hyssops they're different. That's why that one's not on my list. Yeah.
Well, hopefully that answered your question, Ian. And now I'm just gonna switch gears. We have a few people asking about bumblebee nesting videos. So
Yes.
if you just want to talk about what you might be looking for with those.
So let me say that finding bumblebee nests is extremely difficult. And so the information that we currently have is based on anecdotal reports from the early 1900s. No one's extensively studied because they're so hard to find. People have trained dogs to try to find them, and it's just extremely difficult. So what I'm looking for is, if you find a nest, a video of what species is using the nest. So you could just video bees coming in and out, and I can, just like with the flowers, I can slow it down and figure out which species it is. And then I really want to know about the microhabitat. So what is it? Does it look like an abandoned road nest? Is it underground or on the surface is extremely important. And if it's on the surface, what is the plant material that it's in? So anything about that, and this could be, you send me a video plus a note about what's around it, or some pictures of what's around it, just so that I get a sense of microhabitat. And then if I get hundreds of these things, I can piece together what's important from different locations. That's the strategy that I would take. So anything. So to know whether you have a nest or not, you'll see the queens at this time of the year dropping into the grass, and they're nest searching. If they have pollen on their legs, that means they found a nest, and likely they're returning to their nest. But what you want to do is see traffic. So the queen either coming in and out of the same location over multiple days, or if you wait a week or two, you're going to start seeing workers coming in and out. And during the peak for that species, you're going to see lots of bees, lots of traffic, and you'll know it's a nest. So you can wait on it if you need to. But sometimes earlier is better, because things get overgrown and it's hard to know exactly where they are. It's because they seem to do a great job hiding themselves, which is important because skunks love to eat the larvae, and so they know how to hide themselves. So early would be better with the videos, but if you have to wait, any information is better than no information.
So what's the right way to get that information to you? I don't know if
Yeah,
there's a way
sorry.
to do that on Beecology.
No, I would say that for this, just email it to me.
Okay.
And then if we get a lot of great videos, and my inbox becomes flooded, then I will tell them to add it to the app. So we will have a nest reporting function on the app that will make my life easier. But for now, if you put everything in a Google folder, if you wanted to have a single Google folder for your group and just give me access, and each of you could have a separate folder and just dump it in the folder and tell me, hey, I found a nest video. Do you want to check it out? I can go and do that, and we can correspond through email is the best way to do it.
Yeah, that sounds like a great plan. And Judith, I think you already set up a Google folder.
Yeah, I did. I do have a Google photo folder. People have been submitting videos of bees, primarily just kind of floating around, though. I'm not hearing that you're really interested with them cruising.
I'm always interested in I mean, so
Okay.
that will tell me, like, so let me put it this way. So if the bee's cruising with pollen, I know it has a nest. And if you can
okay.
see it cruising, the nest is somewhere in that general area.
Okay.
If it's cruising without pollen, I know which species is there.
Yeah.
But it's nest searching and may or may not find one. So that's
Okay.
how I would separate out the cruising videos. If
Okay.
you see a terricola queen cruising around and you don't see any
Mm.
terricola later in the season,
Mhm.
then you're nest site limited, right? So that queen couldn't find a nest where you are and is somewhere either far away or didn't find a nest, and then they'll just die.
Okay.
So it's useful information.
Okay, so
Definitely.
maybe we'll just let you kind of sort it out.
Oh, of course, yeah, no,
Yeah,
I
just send it to you because you can take a look at it.
taking the video is all the work you
Yeah.
need to do, and I'll do the
Okay.
rest. Yes, I'm
Okay. Very cool.
happy to do the rest. Yes.
Okay. Very good. Okay. Do we have
All
more
right.
questions in the chat? Because I've got a
We
couple questions.
we do have a few more things. So just switching gears real quick again. I really like this one. Are all of our crops hybridized so much that they couldn't be used as pollinators, or could it still be better to use heirlooms? You know, so I guess really just is there a difference between our hybridized crops and our heirlooms?
Well, so again, this gets to feeding bees and the ecological function of pollination as a process. So certainly, bees will visit some of them for nectar and pollen, but because we only see about 5% of the species that are in an area actually visiting the crop plants, that tells us that they're not great sources of pollen and nectar compared to other things that are out there. And so it really depends on the crop and whether it's going to attract a lot or a little. But I would say that there isn't, I don't know if, I mean, looking at apple, cherry, those are pretty good, but putting it up against something like a pedicularis or some of the other things, like it just isn't, that you don't see Fervidus on those plants. You don't see them on apple, or I haven't seen them on apple. They're going for the tubular flowers like pedicularis or the penstemons when they come out. So again, we're trying to restore the connections between native plants and pollinators rather than feeding them, and they may feed on it for nectar and pollen, but that's not what we're trying to accomplish. That's not the
And
goal.
it sounds like you're also saying that whether heirloom or hybridized, our traditional crops for our food system is not what they're going to, that's not their first choice anyways,
That's right. You have
regardless.
to, that's right. That's
Okay.
exactly right. And we need to separate those two completely. So I'm working with smaller farms and they'll have the ecological native biodiversity function, and they also have their crop pollination, and there are some of the native bees, you can help them throughout the rest of the year with native plants that they then perform their ecological function, and then in the spring they do their function as crop pollinators. But those two have to work together, but you can't think that planting more crop plants is going to help the biodiversity issue. It just
Or maybe even
isn't.
just trying like a better quality crop versus a hybrid crop, I think is more what she was thinking, but
Oh,
regardless.
right. Okay, so that, just like the cultivars, right? That when you start to mess with things, you may hit it where it's increases nectar production, or it may eliminate nectar production, and it just
Mm.
depends. It's variable. It depends on the species. So could be yes, it could be no. I mean, I know that's a wishy-washy answer, but that's the best I can do.
That sounds good. All right. Vicky says that the data has been fascinating. Thank you. And wonders if you're interested in citizen science from other states outside of Mass and New Hampshire, maybe
Yes.
Vermont or.
Yes. So as we move west and north, we may get some more species in the mix, like Rufosinctus. But yes, is the answer to your question. I'd love to, the long-term goal is to expand this project west, but it just is, I need to find a contact in the Midwest that could add the bee species to the app and find computer science people to sort of work with moving west. But Vermont is still within the range. So if you find something that doesn't match a bee on the app, odds are it might be one of these other species, and I'll just identify it and I can let you know. So yes, please feel free to contribute if you're not if you're in Vermont or wherever you are. We have people reporting from New York State as well, so it's fine. I
It
welcome it.
sounds like the more the better. It's fine.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd love to see that, the patterns that I see here, you see in New Hampshire, and we start to see everywhere, because then we can say, look, if we're going to conserve the species throughout its native range, here's what we need to do. And I'm seeing those patterns start to emerge with your data and data from New York and Rhode Island. It's very consistent across the range. So yeah, that would be great.
All right. Another question about data. Is there anything that you're looking for with the butterfly data?
Yes, so we're looking for so we have a list of species of conservation concern and based on Mass Butterfly Club data. And so we are looking for more data on butterfly species in general. So I don't have a student that's going to continue data collection on butterflies this summer. I'm recruiting grad students for next year. So if you want to send me butterfly data, that would be great, so we can start to build the database for butterflies.
All right. And then the last comment that we have in the chat right now is from Kathy, who I feel like her sentence speaks for everybody. Thank you so much for the detailed information about the plants and the mindset shift. This is so helpful. I think
Oh,
she's
good.
spot on. Thank you,
I
Kathy.
know my talks, it's information overload, and so it's being recorded, and you may have to go back and watch some things again, but I
That's
feel it's
okay.
better to have too much than too little. And anyway, I
Whether it's
apologize if you feel overwhelmed.
whether it's bees or information.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right. Judith, did you have some
yeah,
questions?
yeah, I actually have two questions. So I had planted a couple of years ago a pollinator patch with a recipe from UNH Extension, which actually was developed 12 years ago. A lot of them are not natives, I would say about 40%, and they're native to the prairies, okay? So things like spotted monarda is taking over, is actually outcompeting the monarda fistulosa and the penstemons, which are really the best stuff that's in there, right? Do you have and so I have another plot that I really would like to plant, but I'd rather seed it than use plugs. It's just, because I've done that before and it's just less expensive actually than trying to buy plugs in a large area. Do you have a recipe? Because I know there's several places where you can buy bulk seed. Well, they'll do a custom mix, like the Vermont
Yes.
Flower Farm, for example. Do you have
So yes, Ernst Seeds, I worked with them and got local ecotypes for most things. And I had a grass sedge mix and then a wildflower mix with Penstemon, Hircitus, digitalis, monarda. So I can find that email with exactly what was in that mix. I will say I threw that seed down and thought it tanked, but last year it just exploded. And I was shocked at how much fistulosa and penstemons I had from that mix. It did very well. And I'm excited to see it this year and what impact it has over. So I seeded a fairly large area at Breakneck Hill and also in Dartmouth. So I can pass that along to you.
That'd be great, yeah, because it does take a couple of years. That was my experience with my pollinator patch, and you have to keep the weeds down too. But it's really a good way to go. The other thing I wanted to ask you, because this was a conversation we had earlier this week. This is something I missed in all your presentations. That with the native plantings I'm doing, I need to have a 1 square meter area. You said, could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because what I'm noticing, I have maybe 3. Lobelia syphilitica, and they're not doing anything because there's only not enough of them to really attract anything.
Right. So my basic rule, and again, this is an empirical question, and so I have plots and I'm piecing this together, but I haven't formally done so. Is the minimum is about 1 square meter for a plant material for to support a couple bumblebee workers. So that's not going to support a whole colony, but what happens is that when bumblebees find a good patch, they repeatedly visit the same patch. And so you can keep a worker there with about a meter square, maybe slightly less than that. That said, I mentioned pedicularis. I have 2 pedicularis plants that are in bloom right now, and they're supporting 2 queens that are regularly visiting, getting nectar and pollen and taking it back. And so I'm able to keep those queens on the pedicularis with a smaller amount. So it definitely depends on the plant species. And when I say a meter, it's a plant material, which, more or less the bloom that you get would support two workers. And if giving a workshop, you could collect, if you want to know whether you're keeping the same worker happy, you can mark it and see that it's the same one coming back. They're pretty good at coming back at the same time of the day. So that's what I've come up with so far. That number will change likely in terms of the minimum. And with solitary bees and butterflies, they take a lot less. So a meter could be overkill for a solitary species, because once they fill up, they're good and they leave, and it doesn't take much to fill up a butterfly, especially if you're talking about, hyssop or Monarda. You see them poke around, couple, 3 flowers, going around, and they're gone. And then they'll come back later on. So that's for a bumblebee, because the social bees are never full until the colony's full. So the workers keep coming back. So it's about keeping them at one location, so that they're continuously bringing nectar and pollen back to the nest.
Wonderful. So I'm seeing that other people want the recipe mix, the seed mix recipe too. So we'll send that out as a resource to everybody afterward. And
yes, I'll look for it tomorrow.
Okay. Are there any other questions? If not, we can go ahead and wrap this up. Looks like not. So, okay. Well, I just want to say that this has been amazing. I mean, this has just been so information rich. I'm going to have to go back and revisit it and review it. We'll be sending a link out to everybody because I didn't grasp it all. But you and your work are really doing so much to fill a much needed gap in our understanding of pollination systems and species diversity. You might you might chuckle at this. One of my natural resource friends this past week called you the Doug Ptolemy of bumblebees, at which said, I'm not sure that Rob would appreciate that. I said he might not mind the Doug Ptolemy part, but he'd probably cross out bumblebees and insert pollination systems.
Yes, I would. And I'll say that Doug is professor emeritus, so he can write books for the popular press, and I'm still struggling away trying to publish peer-reviewed papers. So
right.
So Doug can be the larval bird larva. Anyway.
Right. Well, that was
it's a compliment. I think it's a compliment.
Good.
And I'll say too, I want to thank you. It's not, I mean, my research goes on because of your efforts, like people, like your group and others that are contributing and helping to move things forward, not just the data collection, but also putting the plants in and seeing the results and then passing it forward. Here we have a lot of seed exchange and winter sow events. So people go into the habitats I created and take the seeds, distribute them to the community, and they germinate, and now they're planting them, and then they see these bees in their backyard. I, tell them what to look for, and they get very excited and tell their neighbors and post their pictures on Facebook, and they're very proud, and they should be. So it's that type of thing that's really making a difference, to be honest. And I really appreciate efforts to help to move things along, because I'm seeing a difference. I know it definitely makes a difference, and so I appreciate that.
Well, I would love to hear more about those community networks the next time you meet with us, because that's probably the next step for us. I can't even envision it yet, but anyway, thank you again so very much, and thank you all for being here. We had a really wonderful turnout today.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, thank you to all for attending.
So with that, I think we'll sign off.
All right. Well, have a great night.
You bet. I'm gonna just